Hello everyone and welcome to another Motorsport Magazine podcast in association with Mercedes-Benz.
Remember, Lewis, this is green hell. Take care. Good job, Lewis. Good job.
I'm Ed Foster, I'm the online editor of Motorsport Magazine, and we have a real treat for you today. On my right is Mike Costin, and to his right is Jack Field, both formerly of Cosworth. I'm also joined by Simon Arron, our features editor. Thank you very much for joining us. And of course, Alan Hyde, who is the man behind the camera and makes us all sound, well, a lot better than we do in real life. We've got questions from the readers, and we've also got questions from former Cosworth employees. So we'll get to those in a bit, but first of all, a little bit of background on both Jack and Mike. Jack arrived at Cosworth in 1961, having got to know Mike and Keith at Lotus, where he arrived in 1955. Got to Cosworth and was the stores manager, selling the parts, while Bill Brown sold the engines. Once Bill Brown left, he became the marketing manager on racing products. Mike left school at the age of 15 and took up a 5-year trade apprenticeship at de Havilland Aircraft Company. Met Colin Chapman at a 750 Motor Club meeting and soon started working for him after his falling out with the Allen brothers. Built up Lotus Mark VI kits during the night and then worked at de Havilland's during the day, getting only, I think, Mike, about 4 hours sleep in that period. An astonishing feat. Soon, Keith Duckworth arrived in 1957 and got to know Mike. And from there, the famous Cosworth was created. In 1958, on September the 30th, I think. In the following years, Cosworth developed race engines for the Lotus Cortina, Formula 3 units, Formula 2 units, and then, of course, the famous Cosworth DFV, which would become the most successful racing engine in the history of the sport. 27 years after it was created, the Cosworth DFV, in the shape of the Zetec R V8, won the Drivers' Formula 1 World Championship in 1994 with Michael Schumacher. What an incredible history, and we will be delving into it now. Jack and Mike, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real treat to have you here. I think it's quite nice to sort of rewind and go back to the Lotus days. How did you first, I'll come to you first, Mike, how did you first meet Colin and how did it all start?
Well, I hadn't had anything to do with any form of motor racing. I'd been to the odd motor race as a spectator. But a friend of mine, another apprentice, the Havilland apprentice, Peter Ross, he suggested to Colin that I would be a likely lad to give him a hand because he's got a lot of work on and on Mark VI cars, and he'd split from the Allen brothers. So I did a deal with Colin, basically, that we'd work in our spare time to build kits for the Mark VI, and when we got to number 9, that would be our works car, and we would run that in racing, that was 1953, and we would share the driving, and that was the big carrot, because I really fancied doing a bit of racing, although I'd got no idea what it was all about. The first race, Colin briefed me to if I could get behind Phil DeSuter, who was the hot shoe at the time, in that form of racing, and he said, follow him and you'll learn a lot, and so I did that, and mind you, that was the last time I followed him. I ended up in front after that, but yeah, so that was how I started with Colin, and then Keith came along as a student in his vacation period from Imperial College, and started working for us, and in those days, of course, I was his boss, and we struck up a friendship, and I had the greatest respect for the way he approached his engineering, and that really blossomed, because when he came and worked for us full time as the development engineer on the 5-speed gearbox, the Queer box that was, we were in consultation with each other as to what the mods would be that he would be putting in, and he did a fantastic job, really. But Colin didn't appreciate it, whereas I thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. He really was, even though he was, a young student, ex-student. In fact, somebody put a notice on his desk saying, "Who needs experience? I'm a college student."
Jack, you were at Lotus from 1955 to 61 when you went to Cosworth. What was Colin Chapman like to work for? Was he quite a hard taskmaster?
No, never really bothered me, except that he didn't pay me a lot of money.
I
don't think he paid anybody a lot of money.
That's one of the reasons I could afford to start, because I was still living with my parents, and he tried that quite early on. But I used to be a parts salesman at the Vauxhall dealer across the road. And on his way into work, if there was anything strange he wanted, he used to ask me if I could find something that could be modified to suit. And while he was away at work, I used to go through the General Motors Bible, and if I could find anything that I thought would do it, had all the measurements there, then I used to get it for him on his way home. And after about a year or so of dealing with him on various things, he asked me if I wanted to become a millionaire. So I said, yeah, I'd like that very much. He said, well, one day we will be one of the big six. And he said, you will grow with the company and you will finish up very rich man. So I joined him, I think, for £2 a week,
So what have you done with your millions?
And I was still getting that after 3.5 years, £2 a week. I think Mike at that time, I think he was on £3 a week, so 50% more than me. So that was it.
Yeah, and I've got a question here from a former Cosworth employee. I don't know who, because they were sort of all sent to me as a batch. Could you please explain the terminology Jack Tax?
Yeah, well, I was doing the costing at Cosworth, and so I'd go through the cost of the raw material, how long it was on each different machine, and each machine has a price. And I work it out very carefully, and then add 25%. And they called it Jack Tax. But I did it just to cover any errors I'd made on the calculations. I thought, so I used to give it 25%. But then when Alf Vickers joined the company, he moved it up to 30%. I said, why 30%, Alf? He said, well, how about your wages? And how about storekeepers? And how about the people? He said, it covers all that, and the van driver. So his was 30%. So prices went up dramatically when Alf joined the company, yeah.
Just sort of keeping on the sort of the Lotus period, at the time, obviously Graham Hill was Works driver, and then also, Jim Clarke was winning everything with a Lotus 18. What were they like, to work with, and were they quite friendly to the guys around the office, as it were?
Well, Graham, you've got to bear in mind, the story about how Graham met Colin and myself is perfectly true. Brands Hatch, we were busy with several cars that we were interested in, and there was this chap talking to us all day. He was either talking to me, or he was talking to Colin, or if I dashed off and did something, when I came back, he'd be talking to Colin, and the other way round. And at the end of the day, we gave him a lift back to London in the transporter, which was an old Bedford bus, and brought in some fish and chips, dropped him off at a tube station, and Colin said, "Who's that mate of yours?" And I said, no mate, I thought he was a mate of yours." And that was it. That was Graham. Come Monday, he was at the works wanting a job, and Colin gave him a job in the gearbox shop. Not that he did much work on gearboxes. He was very lucky because the gearbox shop was the only place that had a telephone, and he spent most of his day on the telephone chatting up people to give him a drive. Anybody like John Coombs or Dan Margulies, people like that, who actually let him drive their cars. So Graham was Graham. You couldn't say he was anybody else. Colin, I got on all right with Colin. I only ever had a couple of get stuff matches with him, but apart from that, I worked for him. That was, Colin was never a friend of mine. I don't think he had many friends, really. Jim Clarke being the main one. And so he had employees. Cosworth was different because with Keith we had a social side as well.
I mean, were there ever any days though when you'd see, he had a reputation for being mercurial. Were there any days when he came into the office and you could see the face like thunder and you all kind of kept your heads down and kept out of his way, or was his humour generally okay?
You mean Colin?
Yeah, Colin.
Yeah. Well, Colin never really mixed with people apart from going over job lists, and so he spent most of his time, I think, planning ahead. So he didn't spend so much time having given me the instructions as to what was done. I'm talking about the early days, which was largely from a job list that he would write. And apart from that, he didn't see much of him. In fact, sometimes I didn't see him for 2 or 3 days before a race meeting. But he was, one of the advantages he had with me was that he knew I'd be there at the right time with as much of the work done as possible and arrived just in time for scrutineering.
Now, Cosworth was started in 1958, but you actually stayed at Lotus until 62 because you had another 3 years of your contract left. So actually, Jack, you started at Cosworth in a way before Mike. We
always knew that Mike was going to come, so yeah.
What
were those early days like? Because it must have been a slight step into the unknown. Because I know.
Well, the early days, first ones in the winter used to have to light all the oil heaters, and I think Mike's first office there was up in the roof, wasn't it, Mike?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Keith and I were both up in the roof.
I seem to remember reading somewhere that you said you were lucky to be alive with all of Keith's smoke from his cigarettes.
Well, yes. I mean, it was a blank end. Our office, we had a vertical ladder up the wall, which was made from packing case parts screwed to the wall. And the two of us in this office, it was blank off to his end. So all his smoke had to come past me to get out into the rest of the roof. And below was the welding spot where all the welding and brazing was done. So it wasn't a very healthy atmosphere with Keith and his 60 a day.
And what did the sort of your Lotus colleagues at the time both think of, you going off and setting up this engineering firm? Did they think you were mad going off on your own and doing your own thing, or were they quite supportive of it?
No, they did think it was weird because a couple of them said, "Well, how here you are, you're director of all the companies, you've got your name above the door in the office, secretary, and now you're going down to that little tin pot place down the road at Edmonton." So I said, "Yes, but I reckon I'm doing the right thing."
Turned out all right, didn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, what did you have any particular? When we all know what happened eventually, but did you have any particular sort of objectives or targets in yourself and Keith in the first place? Did you have any broad vision of what you wanted to do?
No, we just thought that a couple of likely lads like us in engineering ought to make our way in motor racing. That was the basis of it. We didn't know that we were going to end up in engines. In fact, we started out in our spare time, what spare time we had, helping people with their Lotus cars. And so it wasn't until Keith really decided and said, "Look, we've got to do something about this situation." He said, it's got to be a full-time job. And he'd got some family money to survive on. He wasn't married, and I'd got a wife and 3 kids to support. So that was when we decided that I'd better sign on the dotted line for another 3 years. And he carried on his own. It was fortunate that at that time, of course, he had a hard time for the first year or so, but then the Ford 105E came on the scene, or didn't come on the scene. Keith, because of his contacts at Ford, from his university, people who'd gone to work at Ford, had a few Ford 105E bits to look at, blocks and cranks and things, because they were smuggled out in people's boots from Dunton Research. And it was decided that was the engine to go for, because he was going to modify the Fiat 1100
for Formula Junior.
And it's fortunate, really, when we made the Lotus 18, that I could convince Colin that we should use the Cosworth engine, because although we ran one against the other with the Sprinzel, John Sprinzel, what do you call his company?
Speedwell, yeah.
Well, Graham was a director of that, and so he was rooting for Speedwell, and I was rooting for Cosworth. But I could say that, look, the BMC A series is at the end of its development period. It can't get much better anyway. And here's this 105E Ford with over square bore and stroke ratio that is at the start of its career, and it should be a better bet. And so fortunately Colin went along with that, which was fortunate for Cosworth, because we decided to make 25 chassis at the beginning of the year for the Lotus 18, and that meant that Keith was going to do 25 engines, plus a few that he did for other people as well. And by the end of that year, we had made 5 batches of 25, so that was 125 engines by the end of the year. And the price of that, the deal was that Lotus bought batches of 10 engines and shipped them down to Cosworth, and Cosworth did strip them and rebuilt them, modified the parts, and tested it, and that was for £145 each, and that was really the thing that kicked off the quantity production at Cosworth.
I was doing a little bit of research earlier, and everybody knows that DFV stands for double 4 valve. I didn't realize what MAE stood for until I did a bit of research. I discovered modified Anglia engine, which is so simple. I love the simplicity.
Quite right.
Yeah. Jack, what made you go from Lotus to Cosworth in '61? Obviously, you got to know Mike and Keith at Lotus. Was it a belief in their engineering and the company, or?
I met my future wife at Lotus, and by 1958 we were engaged, and I thought, Christ, I need to look at how I'm going to buy a house. Certainly couldn't do it on what Colin was paying. So I went back to the Vauxhall Bedford dealer, and they offered me a van on the road, freelance. As long as I didn't call on any existing customers, I'd get 1% commission. So £11 a week, up from about £3 a week from Colin, and 1%. But I had to do over £1,000 a month for it to be viable. And so very quickly I latched into the M1 where they were building, and 90% of the trucks were Bedford. So I lucked in there. First of all, getting the difficult parts, what was keeping vehicles off the road, by chasing round all the London Bedford dealers until I found something, get it back quick, and then eventually I got all their orders. All I had to do was just ring them up, I got all their orders for all the easy stuff as well as the hard stuff. And so I was averaging about 4,000 a month with this grey van, really just working for myself. So getting about £40 a month commission, nearly doubled my salary. But I could see an end coming to it. I thought, well, when the M1's built, my turnover's going to go over the cliff. And then I had the phone call from Keith, come and see him. So I thought, well, I'm on 1,000 a year. If he can carry on paying me 1,000 a year, and it's not, commission's always a bit dodgy. After Lotus, I wasn't sure that this company, Cosworth, was going to look after me much better than Lotus did. But anyway, he paid me, I think, not £950 a year for the first 3 months, and then 1,000 a year. So that's how I joined. It was enough to pay me mortgage, which was £16 a month at that time.
I wish my mortgage was that.
Oh, I know. Mind you, it was only, the house was only 2,700 brand new, so...
I wish my house was that.
Yeah. It's probably worth $500,000 now. Yeah. So, there you go.
Obviously, you know, Cosworth did so many things, but really the thing that it's most famous for, quite rightly, is the DFV. Where did the idea originally come from for that engine? Was it? Can you remember from the sort of mists of time how it first raised its head, or was that lost to the books of history?
Well, before then we had gone into 4-valve engines after the SCA, the single cam, and we'd gone on to the FVA, the 4-valve engine. And that was very successful. And then, of course, Climax said, right, they're out of racing, and Colin was going to be out of Formula One if he didn't do something. And it was so he started looking around to see who was going to finance it to pay us to develop the engine. And it went through Esso. Esso didn't catch on, or any other fuel company, and David Brown, they were interested, but they wanted to be in complete charge of the thing, and Keith said, well, stuff that. And then it came to Ford, and of course Walter Hayes, he took it on board because he knew Colin, and he knew Colin from right back from when Colin, well, I think Walter ghosted a bit for Colin on the Daily Mail or some paper. And he came up with the goods, came up with a 75,000 for the DFV and 25,000 for a research engine, which was what we called the FVB, which was a 1500 version of the FVA. And that was the one we put in our racing car, and I used to race. And then the deal was done. They wanted, Ford wanted an agreement which was going to go to several volumes, and finally it got down, and they said, right, well, you better write the agreement to Keith, and he wrote the agreement in 3 pages, and that was it. They accepted it. So, and that stood us well for the next few years. And then we got down to the layout for the engine, and it all went on from there.
Now, obviously you alluded to it earlier, but actually you did quite a lot of testing. And I think you were the first person to test the DFV, weren't you, at Snetterton?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
And you did something like 175 down the Norwich Straight?
Yeah, I think that was when we worked out the gear ratios and the rolling radiuses and things. And which was quite frightening afterwards, because when you think in those days, the braking was marking plus or minus a bit on the garage that was about 250 yards before the hairpin. And the hairpin was sort of 6 feet wall right around the hairpin of railway sleepers. And it wasn't a place that your brakes fail.
Well, if you did, you'd be on the A11, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
More or less,
right. Well, right.
Yeah.
Only 100 yards off it. Yeah.
Did you know when you tested? I mean, obviously it was a very early example of the DFV, and there was a lot of development to come. But did you know then that you did? Hang on, we built something pretty special here.
Well, it was all rated. It was based on the power. Really, the target figure was 400 horsepower, and all the engines were. The first 7 engines built in 1967, all were between 403 and 408 horsepower. On our dyno, we never thought we could test better than plus or minus 1%, but that was a very small range for performance for those engines. And those were the 7 engines that we built for the 67 season. Mind you, there was an awful lot of work that had to go in during the season to keep them running.
Am I right? Did I read somewhere that actually Jack Brabham helped solve one of the problems on the DFV? Is that right? I seem to remember, and you saying that. Well, we never wanted to tell him because he might have asked for money.
Yeah. Well, that was rather interesting because when we developed the stroke of the distributor, the fuel distributor, on the fuel injection unit, on the dyno, and we plotted what was required for each stage. And then we thought, right now, for running into corners and loading up with fuel or running into corners with almost zero fuel going in, we need a bit of an enrichment in a little area, about sort of wherever you blip to. So we decided where when you heel and toed going into the corner, how much throttle you gave it with your heel, and estimated that spot and riched it up quite a bit, so that you would go in and the engine would go weaker and you'd blip it with a bit of richness. And that didn't particularly work because, it just didn't work. But when every engine came back for its overhaul, the cam that did this would be put in a jig, and we would check and make sure nobody had been messing about with it. And one day we checked one of Brabham's engines, and lo and behold, it followed exactly our curve from the original plots off the dyno. And what he'd done, he'd cut out that richness bit, and it was a straight curve as required on the dyno. And so we thought, that most likely is a benefit. But as you say, we didn't say anything.
Now, before we go anywhere, I must tell you about the latest Mercedes promotion. This one's a really good one, and it celebrates Mercedes being world champions yet again in Formula One. You get 20% off all their official merchandise at their online shop, which is shop.mercedes-benz.com. All you need to do is enter the code 2016-champions when you get to checkout. The code is only valid until the end of the month, so be quick and have a look in the next few days. And they're only valid for orders within the UK. Right, so back to the DFV. Obviously, I'm sure there are other examples, but the fact that it went out and it won its first race, was there a small sigh of relief? I mean, I know there was a retirement, Graham Hill retired, but was it a small sense of relief that it went out and it was so successful straight away? Because really, you don't know until you actually race the thing whether it's going to work 100%, do you?
That's right. No idea, really. And it was very fortunate that one of them finished, because subsequently we found a lot of problems in 2 areas. Well, we'd already found a lot of problems because on the design of the DFV there were things which were wrong. The first thing was the breathing, crankcase breathing, which was very bad. We knew that on the dynamometer before we ever went into the car. And those engines in 1967 had some fairly dreadful tubing to try and get over the oil breathing problem. And so that was a problem that stuck with us for quite up until Keith redesigned the scavenge system to take out a lot more than we were using about 6 gallons per minute of oil going around the engine, and in those days the recommendation was that you design for twice that volume to take account of gas coming out, getting past the rings. And so we doubled that and said, right, 12 gallons a minute's the weight of it. But Keith redesigned the whole of the scavenge system and included centrifuges to take the air out of the oil. We pumped up to 55 gallons a minute, and that cured all our breathing problems. The other problem, of course, was the problem with the gears. We had all sorts of problems with the timing gears, and that was a very, very difficult problem. We hadn't got the benefit that you have now of being able to measure everything, and it wasn't until we actually checked up where this fantastic load that was breaking everything in sight came from. And then Keith went off and designed the what we call the quill hub, and that was the last of the real problems. I suppose neither of those problems could necessarily have been seen by a designer, so I still think Keith did a very good job.
And when Keith finally retired from Cosworth, wasn't he presented with this multi-quill timing gear, all polished up? And I think with the words, with these quills, you wrote a new book in the history of motor racing.
That's right, yeah. I should think that every Formula One engine now still has to have some form of quill hub to make the drives to the camshafts survive.
What are your most vivid memories of Zandvoort 67?
Well, I wasn't there. in fact, I didn't go to any races that year. Keith went to every race. The only one he didn't go to was Mexico, and he said, "You'll have to go to Mexico." So I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, I'm not going there because my gut won't cope with the Mexican food." So that was the only Grand Prix I went to.
Cope with 60 cigarettes a day, but not the Mexican food.
No, that's right.
But what are you, obviously you weren't actually at the circuit, but what are your memories of the sort of immediate aftermath of getting the phone call with Warren and all that sort of stuff? Just wondered what you recollect from the immediate aftermath of that weekend.
Well, I'm not the sort of bloke that jumps up and down. I've never had what's called an adrenaline rush. In all my driving racing cars, I've never experienced any form of adrenaline rush. I just enjoy it, driving. In fact, really, when I started with Colin, the big part of our deal was that we'd share the driving, and that was the real thing that got me to agree to it. So, no, I'm not a bloke who gets excited about anything much.
Jack, this obviously the Cosworth DFV. I think Colin wanted an exclusive license to use it for Lotus. Keith and Mike quite rightly said no. And very quickly, it became the engine to have. You must have been, because it was your job to sell them, wasn't it? So you must have been had quite a job on your hands in terms of the sheer number that were going out the door.
The first inquiry we got was from Ken Tyrrell, of course. It's been well recorded. But then I think we was helped greatly by March as well. I mean, they produced a Formula One car, which anybody could buy, and you could call it what you like, and go motor racing if you had your Hewland box and your Cosworth engine. And the decision was to make so many, say 12, and then sell them. So we just make what we can sell. And next year, we say, right, we're making 20. By which time everybody was clamouring to get them. And you say we ration them fairly. So when we used to look and see what engines were in with each team and see if they were struggling because of not having enough engines, and we used to decide who used to get the 20.
Can I ask you what a Cosworth DFV would have cost me if I was a team owner back in the late 60s, early 70s?
What it would cost?
Yeah, to buy an engine.
I can't remember the cost. We used to sell for 7,500, and which I always thought, even in those days, was too cheap.
I'm trying to think of what you could get done for 7,500 on a Cosworth DFV nowadays. I didn't, nothing. I don't think
half a Pirelli left rear or something. You probably,
exactly,
I'm not entirely. Was it 7,500? Did that include the Alf tax or the Jack tax, or was?
Yeah, that included all that. All that was in part.
Yep.
But you had to make sure that the engine components came to more than the 7.5 grand. Otherwise, you get engine builders knocking them out. So that was about it. But I think one of the best deals that's ever done on the DFV price was Alf called me in one day and he said, "Who's buying all these engines?" I said, "Alf, you know. There's Tyrrell, there's McLaren, there's Brabham." He said, "Who's paying for them?" So I said, "Well, they are." So he said, "Well, where's they getting the money?" I said, "Off sponsors." So he said, "Yeah. Where's the money coming from?" I said, "Well, mainly Switzerland, see." And we had one customer, Count Zonon, used to buy them and give them away. He said, "Put some blue ribbon on it and send that one to Ken," or whatever, you know. I think he used to do it just to get, so he was well received in the paddock, you see. But anyway, Alf got it. So he said, "Well, so the money's coming from Switzerland." So I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, how much is the DFV in Swiss francs?" So I said, 90,000 Swiss francs. That was 12 to the pound at the time. So he said, "Right, Keith won't move on the price of 7.5 grand, but I might be able to talk him into selling it Swiss francs." He said, "Because the pound is going to fall in value against the Swiss francs. So all we do every year is convert the 90,000 Swiss francs back to pounds." I said, "He won't go for that." He said, "Well, I think no, he would." So anyway, a couple of days later, he come back. He said, "That's what we do. Price of the engine is 90,000 Swiss francs." He said, "What do they think of that price?" I said, "They think it's bloody expensive." So, so we converted, and I think the first year, I think it went from 7,500 to about 12,500. So it covered me jack tax and everything, you know. So and that's when it started to climb.
I must take some readers' questions here. I've got in my notes actually to obviously talk about the Cosworth four-wheel drive car. There's actually a question here from Gabor from Hungary. And he wants to know how Cosworth came up with the idea of building its own F1 car, and why did you choose four-wheel drive rather than rear-wheel drive?
Well, four-wheel drive was the thing to be talked about at that time. And Keith, we were a very profitable company, and Keith was always up for another challenge. And he thought, well, it'd be a good idea to make a Formula One car. And so, one way or another, he got hold of Robin Hurd, who at that time was slightly involved already in creating March. and he employed him to come and design the car. And so he was given free hand to design the car. When he got to designing the hubs and drives to the hubs, and Keith saw what he was doing, Keith was so upset, he said, right, forget that, I'll design those bits. And he designed the wheels and the hubs and the attachment system, and he also said, right, well, ZF can do the front and rear diffs, non-slip diffs, but I'll design the central 45-55 torque split for the four-wheel drive, which was a really well-designed bit of kit and never gave any trouble at all. Well, the small bit of running we did anyway. I don't think it would have given trouble. Funnily enough, the hub attachment and the wheel happened to be very similar to what March came out with when they designed the car, and so
Robin Herd having moved there, of course.
If you wanted to wind up Keith, you could say, "Oh, Robin's done a bloody good job designing those March wheels." Really wound him up. So anyway, no, it wouldn't have gone anywhere, I don't think, because the first thing was that we were going to want some special tyres, and Dunlop wouldn't think about going into it. Everybody else made four-wheel drive, Lotus. But their answers to the problems were the real problem was the feedback through the steering was so bad that, well, I certainly couldn't do more than 5 laps, and I was knackered. My arms were knackered because of the forces. It was even worse driving the blooming Porsche that I once drove. That was the most difficult car I ever drove. Anyway, if we'd have carried on, we got such a big job list of things to do, and we were so busy with all other projects that Keith said, that's enough, right, told Bill, flog it. So Bill sold it to the museum for 4,000 quid without an engine, or without an engine and gearbox, and that was the end of it. But I think to do it, you would have had to have quite a large team of people to look after the engineering. And in any case, Robin Herd had pushed off because March started properly, and that was the end of it.
There's a question here from Nick Mitchell, who wanted to know about the experience of driving the Cosworth four-wheel drive car, which you've just mentioned. But he was wondered, does your experience relate to John Miles's of the Lotus 623, where he said that it was difficult to load up and then it let go in a very unpredictable manner on corner exit, altering the trajectory of the car?
Well, you've got to bear in mind that I wasn't liable to push it too far anyway at that stage. I was quite staggered that Colin agreed with Keith that I should do the first bit of testing. Of course, the car was so badly set up that it was undrivable in a straight line, whereas you needed about 1/4 inch toe in on the back axle, on the back wheels. It had been set up by the Lotus people with 2.5 inches toe out, so it was undrivable in a straight line. And they were taking the mickey out of me, saying, "Oh, well, you can't drive it because you haven't driven anything with this much power." So I told them where to go. Anyway, the clutch packed up, as I told AP, the Lockheed, the AP, that their twin plate that they designed for the DFV was a stupid thing. So I went and saw Bob Dance. We took it back in the workshop, had a look at the clutch, and the friction discs had fallen apart, as I told they would. I told the AP they would. And I went and saw Bob Dance, who was running the Cortinas at the time, and said, "Hey, have you got one of our Cosworth twin plate frictions?" So he said, "Yeah." Okay, so we stuck that in, and that became the standard for the next few years. Anyway, and I said, "Hey, now Halfman, let's have a look, see where the wheels are pointed." So we put some drummers along and found out this toe out was ridiculous. So we put that straight, and then the next day we took it to Snetterton, where it handled very nicely, and the engine performed pretty well. And as you say, after about 10 or 15 laps or whatever it was, I was really, really motoring and enjoying it, and the engine was behaving extremely well. Yeah, that about covers it, I suppose.
I'd obviously want to go on to sort of the further things in the Cosworth history. I was just going to take a couple of questions from the former colleagues at Cosworth. I quite like this one. What was your most rewarding time at Cosworth? Was it sort of the development of the DFV, or was it something entirely different that perhaps Cosworth wasn't so famous for?
No, I think life at Cosworth was enjoyable, whatever we were doing. We were a fantastic company, really, insofar as everybody knew everybody else. Certainly until we employed a few hundred people. In fact, I dare say even to this day, I bet I know more people on the shop floor who haven't retired yet than are known by the board of directors put together. Because, I spent a lot of time on the shop floor discussing with things being made and things being overhauled and things being tested. And the whole lot was equally enjoyable. I can't really point any sort of particular period.
Now, I have a vested interest in this next bit because my mum's actually got an Escort Cosworth RS that she goes to Tesco in and to do her shopping. Funny enough, she actually asked for the spoiler to be put back on. I won't say what her age is, but the spoiler is now back on the back. So the Sierra Cosworth project, it was something that actually fundamentally changed the company because it was so busy that you had to split the roads and racing divisions. One thing I really wanted to know about what were the tests you had to go through for this engine? Because some of them were unbelievable tests that were kind of imposed by Ford that you had to put this engine through, weren't they?
Well, they were standard tests.
Blimey. I didn't realise they were standard. I thought.
Oh yes, Ford have a sort of 3-inch thick file of all the tests, and you just have to go through it. That's it. And not only that, having passed all these tests, then you get engineering sign-off, and then it goes to production, and then the production director, having been caught out times before, with the engineering signing off and him going into production and then having problems, he says, okay, I've got a lot of people now, they're going to test the engine, they're going to do all the same tests as you've done, and they're not even engineers, and the engine's got to pass. But, tests like 180-hour tests. You start the engine. It's got to be what they call an off-tools, a development, a pre-production engine, and you allow 15 seconds after it started for the oil pressure to come up, and then it goes flat strap, max RPM, full throttle for 180 hours, and all you're allowed to do is change the oil every 25 hours. And at the end of that, everything has to be within limits. Or when you strip it, pistons, valve seats, everything's got to be within limits. 300-hour test, which is half of a 600-hour test, where you're on a 12.5-hour cycle from max speed, max torque, tick over, max speed, max torque, backwards and forwards for 12 hours, and then you repeat that 12 hours, that cycle for 300 hours. Then you strip the engine, everything's got to be still within limits, and then you're allowed to replace gaskets only and rebuild it and do the same test again, another 300 hours. So then scuffing tests, piston scuffing, you have 4,000 litres of freezing water in a tank, and you fill the engine with this, and you start it, and you run at maximum speed, flat out, max speed, and the temperatures, the water temperature has to go up at least 1 degree a second to 120 degrees, and then you stop the engine back to tick over, switch all the water cocks, and the freezing water comes down and fills the engine with freezing water again, and then straight back up to, and you have to do that 10 times, and then strip the engine down, and there mustn't be any sign of any piston or ring scuffing. That's a difficult thing to do.
Blimey. My dad always taught me to never rev a cold engine, but it turns out that you can, actually.
Oh,
yeah. Jack, I obviously asked Mike earlier, what was your most rewarding time at Cosworth? When did you know, which kind of period you look back on most fondly?
When I was moved over away from DFV, just looking after the 4-cylinder, Cosworth components, and with the help of Alistair Lowell, who I wasn't supposed to use on the design side, Keith said, right, you go over there with Frank Webb, Bill Pratt. You can't use anybody from the design office. You can't test any engines. If you can't get the stuff made in the machine shop, you get it made elsewhere. And he said, just go from there. So at that time, it was turning over about $500,000. So, but to me, going to somewhere like Atlanta, where they have the run-offs, all the amateur racers, the best go there and they run off. First time there, I sold took orders for 47 engines. Because you've got the Atlantic engine, and you've got the 2-litre engine, and then Alistair Lowell, I said, can you do a 1300? So he did a 1300, the BDH, got it tested down at Swindon, and that went as a sports car. And then the other one was the 1100, the BDJ. And Alistair said, well, it's not going to be much good, the 1100. I said, will it do better than the Mark 11 or the SCA? So he said, yeah. I said, right, we'll go for it then. So here we were. We got the 1100, got the 1300, the 1600 Atlantic, the 2-litre. And it was all coming out of Cosworth's store. So, you know, the turnover just went through the roof. Yeah.
It was incredible, obviously the rate of the growth of the company. Looking back now, what were your thoughts, when it got so big? Was it still as much fun then, Mike, when Cosworth was this sort of huge company? Or was it the early days, when it was just a handful of people, coming up with engineering solutions?
Well, yes, it did get more tedious because we got bigger staff and more things away from engineering, a lot of meetings and things like that.
I'm with you on that one. Hate meetings. Hate meetings.
And then eventually it did get very difficult, but things happened. And finally, Keith decided one day he was going to disappear. And by then, of course, we were a large company and a few people. We had a managing director in those days who did a fantastic job, really, for the company while he was there. We were owned by Vickers, and they talked me into staying on another year. I wanted to retire at 60, but they talked me into staying until I was 61, and being called chairman. I wasn't chairman really, but they decided it'd be better if I was called chairman. And then I retired at 61, and I've been lucky to stay now to my ripe old age now, for the last 26 years enjoying life. But certainly up until the last few years weren't nearly as good as the early years.
What do you think today? I mean, I've been to Cosworth a few times in recent years. I mean, do you recognise it is? I mean, it occupies, for those who don't know, a huge part of an industrial estate in Northampton, both sides of the road, and there are more and more units going up. It seems, everywhere you look, there are Cosworth buildings. I mean, do you identify that as being the same company that you were involved with all those years ago?
Not really, but on the other hand, it's about the same size now. No, it's not. It's about maybe 20% larger than when I retired. But the Cosworth Racing, of course, is a very small part of it, and the rest is now Marla. It's now called Marla Powertrain UK. Yes, but it's still the same area, the same size, but bigger. Of course, the racing side, I think they've got this deal with Honda, so they build yet another factory farther down the road. Yeah, it's
and they've still got Keith's original drawing board there, which is quite nice.
Oh, have they?
Yeah, which I think is nice. Yeah, I mean, there's an array of bygone engines, and Keith's. The drawing board on which he drew the sketch of DFV is still there. Actually, I mean, there is still clearly a great pride in the company's heritage, racing.
Yes,
heritage.
I'm glad they kept that, because it does show right back to the start. That was largely the part of a chap called John Given that I took on in the days when I used to run all the testing myself. And I took on John Given straight from his apprenticeship to run the test department. And eventually he became our works and bricks man. A lot of people at Cosworth ended up not doing the job they started with. And he was one. In fact, most of our factories, he was responsible for dealing with the architect and the builders right the way through, when we built factories down the road and Wellingborough and all over the place. So, yeah.
I've got a question here from Robert Moy, which I quite like, and I'm interested to know the answer. When was the last time you wielded a spanner, and what was it for?
I wheel spanners every day now.
What do you mostly work on?
Yesterday was central heating.
Well, there we go. From the Cosworth DFV to central heating. I'm just going to jump in with a couple of other questions. We'll jump around a bit, but this is again from some Cosworth employees. Would you prefer to be a highly competitive and accomplished racing driver or highly respected engineer?
I suppose I was never a highly respected racing driver. I used to enjoy racing, but I would never have been a Verstappen. Because I was quite capable of getting around a circuit very quickly, but I was always pretty careful otherwise. Keith reckon, I always used to say, well, I only drive at 90%. He said, yeah, I know. He said, you drive at 90% until some bugger's in front of you. No, I suppose I'm better known as an engineer, although really I was assistant engineer. I'm an assistant engineer to a lot of really good engineers, primarily Keith. But we had a lot of really good engineers, and although I was their boss, I was still involved in what they were doing. Of course, this became, when we split the company in about 1985, when Keith took on the Cosworth Sierra program, he didn't know what he was signing up to. And it wasn't until we were in dead trouble getting the first engines built and tested that he called me in one day when we had offices next to each other. He said, right, he said, we've just got to split road engine. We used to call it road engines, you know, working for Mercedes and Opel and Vauxhall and Chevrolet and that sort of thing. You've got to bear in mind, up until 85, we'd done more General Motors projects than Ford. So he said, that's right, we've got to split it down the middle. He said, I'll be chief engineer racing, you be chief engineer road engines. And he said, you'll have to go and find somewhere to do it as well. And again, that's where John Given came in. I said to John Given, John, you've got to find some premises. And so virtually the next week, I set off. John found a place just across the road where he took over half somebody else's, a garden machine supplier, took over half his premises. And I moved over there with Mike Hall as chief designer and a few other lads. John Given, our quality manager, and a couple of engine builders, and it all developed from there.
Now we are running out of time, sadly, but I think I've got time for one more question, and one from Simon if he wants to jump in. What's your fondest memory of Keith when you sort of look back on your time together? What's your sort of your most fond moment?
Well, again, you know, Keith wasn't a very excitable person, nor was I, but we got on very well together socially, and we had a good few laughs, and I think that's about the weight of it, really. We had a long, good relationship with plenty of laughs as well as work.
I'd just like to ask both of you what you think. I mean, you both lived at the hub of an era when Formula One was relatively accessible, despite your 90,000 Swiss franc engines. What do you think when you see the sport today? I mean, it is so much less accessible in many ways. Do you still watch it? And if so, what do you think of Formula One in the modern era?
Well, I always watch the Formula One races, and I must admit, I don't find it so interesting, simply because now it's almost a foregone conclusion. And
do you find the engineering interesting in the hybrid era?
Well, that's just too complex. I couldn't understand any of it. I wouldn't even try. But I do have a grandson who works for Mercedes, aerodynamicist, and I enjoy talking to him and trying to get something out of him, but he's very tight-lipped about it all.
Jack, what do you think of the modern era Formula One?
Well, I don't think I would have liked to have been there now. I prefer it when, you know, there was the kit cars running, and I thought it was much better. I remember in the early days at Lotus, when they went off to Spa or somewhere, loads of car up in the back of the comma truck or bus, wasn't it? And of course the battery was always flat, so the factory used to turn out, push the comma back onto Tottenham Lane and down the hill to get it started. Halfway down the hill it would start, and they're off to Spa or somewhere, and always wondered how they managed to get there in that. But you reckon that was quite a new bus? Well,
yeah, that was Colin designed the bodywork. He scrounged the comma chassis, designed his bodywork to carry two Mark 9s. They were.
Yeah.
It never did carry two. You just about squeezed one in, and the other one had to go on the trailer behind.
Well, that's Colin's packaging, isn't it? Sort of tight and compact. So it's, you know.
Well, that was Colin's design. You know, people say to me, you know, how do you rate Colin against Keith as, you know, pure engineers? And I'm afraid I say, well, yeah, two entirely different people. But if it comes down to engineering, pure engineering, I say Colin's not even knee high to Keith. Mind you, that's just the way I see it. Lotus people won't have it any other way.
Well, what an incredible amount of success Cosworth has had and still has to this day. Mike, thank you so much for coming and joining us, and Jack, thank you so much for coming in as well. Simon, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Alan, for making us all sound okay, I hope. We're actually going to be back at the end of this month for another motorsport podcast in association with Mercedes-Benz, and we're off to visit Lord March at Goodwood to chat to him. So that will be another fantastic hour of listening, hopefully. We'll see you all then in a few weeks' time. Thank you very much for listening and watching. Bye-bye.
Remember, Lewis, this is green hell. Take care. Good job, Lewis. Good job.